Okay, I miscalculated the time. Turns out we had a couple of minutes. So let's go ahead and do another consideration of Kant's attempt to justify his transcendental skepticism that is at the background or the fundament of his peculiar method in constructing a philosophical ethics. Okay? Uh, why do we do this? Because if his basic epistemological position. Now, when I say transcendental skepticism, that's not a metaphysical position. It's the denial that any metaphysical position can be justified. And that makes it an epistemological position because Kant first answers a question about the possibility of knowledge before any other question. And his question about the possibility of knowledge in the area of metaphysics, about reality as such, is a negative judgment. You can't have knowledge in that particular area. Now, he then qualifies that later. I mean, the name of the book that you've been reading, by the way, is Groundwork for the Fundament of the Metaphysic of Morals, right? So I hate to confuse you. He will redefine what the word metaphysics means and then rehabilitate it later. Okay, don't worry about that. What you need to know is that he rejects the entire tradition of metaphysics on the basis of the conclusion that metaphysics is impossible, and that's an epistemological conclusion. All right, so now let's see if he can go ahead and once again try to substantiate his transcendental skepticism. He pursues this in an interesting way in his third antinomy. And here he considers two contradictory positions. Remember, an antinomy always involves two contradictory positions, P and not P. And then he argues, when Kant presents antinomies, he argues that one can demonstrate both convincingly, right? And then he proceeds to argue that since one can demonstrate both sides of an antinomy convincingly, one has to look for the underlying assumption, right, of the entire dispute or the entire controversy, right, and then remove that underlying assumption because it's the underlying assumption that generates the contradiction. It's exactly like it's just a slightly souped up version of the method I taught you at the beginning of the course. Okay, it's a philosophical method. All philosophers are the same, guys, in the final analysis. All right. The first position he considers is everything happens in accordance with necessity. And the second is there is freedom acting as a cause in nature. So freedom, that would mean spontaneity. That means not cause. That means not in accordance with necessity. Okay. So if we assume that everything happens in accordance with necessity, then we must put down that every event has a cause. But this means that there is no first event, right? Because if there were a first event, that would contradict the idea that every event has a cause. Okay. So the result is that while each event has a relative cause, there is no cause that is sufficient to explain the entire sequence of causes and effects. That is, there is no sufficient reason for the whole series to exist. So the series itself becomes unexplained, and if you like, becomes spontaneous, but let's move on. If we assume there is freedom, namely that there is an uncaused act, then we must affirm an event without a cause, right? That's what Kant means by freedom. This Kant maintains is unintelligible. There cannot be an event without a cause. So we can affirm neither position and must be skeptical regarding the fundamental question. So if you assume that every event has a cause, we end up with a series of events that itself as a series is unexplained. If you postulate spontaneous freedom, right, uncaused freedom, you postulate something which is unintelligible, that is an event without a cause, right? All right, that doesn't work either. So whether you assume everything is caused or you assume that there's something that's uncaused, in either case you end up with something unintelligible. right? So we have to reject both. Now, this is where Kant distinguishes himself. He goes a step further, and now, by the way, let's back up for a second. I taught you at the beginning of the course, according to philosophical method, when you have an antinomy or both sides of a contradiction, exactly one is true, exactly one is false, right? And that's that. You can't say they're both false. Okay, you see what I'm saying? But this is what Kant says. He goes a step further. He tries to show that you can find a deeper presupposition and say that that's false, right? And that's how you ended up with the later contradiction. So he goes a step further and argues that we have to dissolve the whole debate by affirming that the cosmos, this is the presupposition, by affirming that the cosmos is not a real being. So the entire debate concerning whether all events have a cause or whether there can be a spontaneous event, that presupposes the thesis that the universe that we live in is a kind of substance. It's a kind of basic being, whole and complete in itself, okay? That has properties that subsist in it independently of our human faculty of knowing and representing things. That's what Kant denies. Now, we haven't studied Kant's critique of pure reason. It's not our business here, but I'll tell you that for Kant, even space and time are relative. They only exist relative to the human mind, okay? We organize things in spatial relationships and in temporal relationships because that's how human beings do things. Things in themselves are neither spatial nor temporal. We have no justification in assuming that they are, let's put it that way. And if they were, that'd be quite a thing because there's no reason for them to be so, according to Kant, right? Can't justify the conclusion that things are in and of themselves spatial and temporal in their relations to one another. And it's a radical step to take, but he takes it. Okay, so if there is no universe that subsists on its own, then there is nothing, which can be nothing but necessity throughout, right? Every single event having a cause, or which could exist spontaneously or have spontaneous events within it. There's neither one nor the other. Okay, so that gets rid of the problem, and he can recline into his skepticism now, right? Okay. So, however, Kant overlooks two distinctions. The first is that between an event and an act. A spontaneous act is not for that reason an event. An event is something which occurs within space and time. An act need not be thought of as occurring in space and time, or at least as not as having spatio-temporal characteristics in the way that Kant thinks of events having. Hence, even if every event need have a cause, which does make good sense, it does not follow that every act have a cause or need have a cause, right? Okay. The second distinction, and if you're still struggling with this distinction between event and act, the second distinction should help. The second distinction is that between a temporal and an atemporal cause. An atemporal cause would be an eternal act. Okay, that's the difference. If you consider the possibility that there are two modes of being, temporal and atemporal, or that is eternal, then an act in the mode of eternity, of course, would not have a cause. It would be simply identical with itself, without beginning and without end. Not unfolding in time, simply as itself, simple and eternal. Okay? That would not be an event. Likewise, we can affirm that there is a cause for every event, and that the very existence of an event as such requires an atemporal cause. Okay, so you can maintain both. We would then add that events occur in the order of secondary causation, and that the atemporal act that brings being to events exists in the order of primary causation. Okay, I should say grants, not brings. Okay, so the atemporal act that grants being to events exists in the order of primary causation, and that would answer Kant's concern with, well, if every event has a cause, then the entire sequence of causes and effects, or the entire sequence of linked events itself doesn't have a cause. You say, well, of course it has a cause. It has a cause outside of itself, an atemporal, eternal cause. And that is not an event, that's an act. Therefore, that there is necessity throughout nature is compatible with there being a transcendent cause of the existence of that system of necessity. No difficulty there. Kant further ignores the possibility that there are finite intelligible beings, like us, who can alter causal sequences in nature by acting on nature from a position that is partially outside of the natural system. Once such external causal influence of your will, once that is exercised, the subsequent series of causes and effects unfold with necessity. He may ultimately take this up in part 3 of the groundwork. So, yeah, I mean, he does obviously address freedom, and we talked about that above, but not freedom in a material cosmos. You can have a material cosmos, a real subsisting cosmos, and human freedom, provided you understand human beings as being partially resident in the cosmos and partially outside, in virtue of having what traditionally we call a soul, which would then exercise, if you like, causation, which would then alter the sequence of events in the cosmos, which sequence of events would then unfold in accordance with the immanent laws of the cosmos, until somebody else performed an act of freedom, altering things yet again. And of course, there'd be acts of freedom occurring all the time. And there's no difficulty in that either. So he further ignores the impossibility of an infinite achievement. The impossibility of an infinite achievement. You can't walk your way to infinity. You can take 1,000,000 steps, 10 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion, a quadrillion, even Googleplex, which is 1 followed by 101 zeros if you live long enough. But you can't walk an infinite number of steps. And that means the universe can't have done it either. So the past has to be limited. There has to be a first point. Okay? Hence, what we call the cosmos must have a temporal beginning. If it has a temporal beginning, that first moment of the cosmos requires a cause outside of time, an atemporal cause. Okay? So these considerations indicate that Kant's transcendental skepticism is not sufficiently well motivated, or not still lacking a convincing justification. So if that's the case, then we'd have to look beyond Kant and back to one of the earlier thinkers. You're also welcome to go ahead and continue to work with Kant, see if you can make his system work.